Good evening, dear friends. My name is Igor Yakovenko. It's now 22:01 in Kiev. And as we agreed, we have... All right, just a second. I'll turn off the broadcast, excuse me. So, well, here we are. This is the 168th live broadcast, episode of the program Mediafrenia. What is happening today in Russian propaganda is connected not only in Russian propaganda, but also in the Russian political sphere. It is connected to yet another feature of the Russian fascist Reich. It lies in the fact that this state, this country, is a parasitic country. And it's a very particular kind of parasite. Without producing absolutely anything except hatred and instruments of killing, nothing that people actually need, Putin's fascist Reich has acquired a huge layer of professional patriots who have flooded the entire political and media space. And these creatures, 24/7, diligently sling mud at those countries from which they receive everything necessary for life: clothing, shoes, furniture, good cars, phones, means of communication. Whenever I hear yet another shriek from Russian propaganda, for example, in Solovyov's studio or in the State Duma, it doesn't matter, whether it's about the decaying West, the decline of Europe, and so on, I always picture a certain hypothetical scene in my mind. What if right now in Solovyov's studio or at a session of the State Duma or the Federation Council, suddenly everything invented and produced in the West disappears? Outside, it doesn't matter. In the West, in the East, everything outside of Russia. And only what was created in Putin's Reich remains. Unfortunately, it won't be possible to examine the details of this horrifying picture right away, because the patriots will immediately be plunged into total darkness. After all the lighting equipment is imported. But if we light candles or a torch, those can definitely be made in Russia, then we'll see a terrifying scene. Completely naked people who in an instant have lost everything, their clothes, shoes, phones, cars, means of communication, wandering in the darkness, bumping into each other, suddenly deprived of their freedom, and even the meaning of their existence, since the ability to spread their lies would also be instantly taken away from them. And it is precisely in such a situation, this thought experiment always comes to my mind when I see it. This lying about Western countries on Russian television or in the Russian public sphere. But it is exactly this kind of situation that the Russian army found itself in after Elon Musk blocked Starlink for the Russian occupiers. And so a hysteria broke out in the Russian media, which of course was led by Vladimir Solovyov, who declared a space war on Elon Musk.
Or you need to pick up the phone and call Musk, since at some point the relationship turned sour. And calmly, quietly explain to him to come to his senses. Not just for the Russians, just shut it off completely, will you, Starlink? Shut it off completely. Call that guy from Palantir and ask him, are you fighting your own war? If you're fighting your own war, then I can't guarantee anything. So, for example, what would happen if we strike the factories that produce Starlink right now? And what if we strike in outer space? It's not selective after all. So, of course, our satellites will burn up too, but to hell with them. But if, for example, the entire Starlink satellite constellation is taken out by an explosion in space, if something happens to it, so what? America wants to intervene over this, but if America steps in for Starlink, that means America is at war with us on Ukrainian territory. So the question is simple. Elon Musk is at war with Russia. In what capacity? Under the American umbrella? Or in his personal capacity? If it's in his personal capacity, then we can wage war against Elon Musk and all his organizations as well. The same goes for the Palantir organization. There just needs to be some understanding of what's going on. Otherwise, they think they can harm us, and in response, we'll just hit the stick instead of the hand that's holding it. Well, you have to admit that's strange.
I wonder, what more does Solovyov need to just go ahead and declare war on the United States of America, since Ukraine is using American air defense systems, American shells, American missiles? What else is needed? Well, somehow it just doesn't work out. And those who are cut off from communication, the occupiers are trying to find at least some kind of alternative and are recording an appeal to the subscribers of a Z channel.
To the subscribers of the Telegram channel to help us acquire communication equipment, specifically radio bridges, as well as repeaters for the radio stations, the so-called Tutki. Right now, unfortunately, the connection has gone down. Starlink is out, and we are left practically without communication. If you have the opportunity, we would be very grateful. Thank you.
So, it's actually pretty funny when you think about it. I mean, they're reaching out, they're looking for support from the subscribers of Z Telegram channels. Well, people just aren't able to make cause and effect connections, because it suddenly turned out that the great geostrategist who leads the fascist Reich got involved in this war without even having communications in his own army. He set out to fight NATO. After all, Solovyov himself keeps shrieking that we're at war with NATO, and Putin says the same thing. He set out to fight NATO using NATO's own technologies. Well, of course, at the crucial moment, they were switched off. In other words, they practically have nothing of their own. Russia, meanwhile, Russia is planning to go to war with practically the whole world. The funniest thing is that Putin's entourage, together with Putin himself, decided that with Trump's arrival in the White House, the United States of America would automatically become an ally of Russia. And as for Musk, he's basically one of ours, practically family. Let's remember how his father was received in Russia. It was a grand show. Musk's father was received so officially. What was that? Not just like the Pope of Rome, but as if he were the head of the entire world. With that kind of pomp. And now we see how Russian propagandists, in particular, let's take a look at how the hosts of Komsomolskaya Pravda, Igor Izmailov and Alexander Kod, are lamenting. They thought the Americans would disconnect Starlink from the Ukrainians, but as it turns out, the Americans actually disconnected it from the Russians. And the main disappointment of 2026 is that Elon Musk turned out not to be pro-Russian. And for some reason, about the American,
that, like the Americans, you'll turn off Starlink for Kyiv, right? The spirit of Anchorage and so on. Kazakh ends up against the backdrop of these negotiations with them turning off Starlink for us, leaving it in Ukraine.
The absurdity, some kind of article against us, for what? Are the propagandists of Komsomolskaya Pravda. But now even on Russian television, the impassioned speeches of patriots about how we will develop our own technological programs look so ridiculous that even Solovyov treats this nonsense with skepticism. Here,
we're building our own technology, as President Vladimir Putin says. I think we will.
We have managed to succeed. And what specific advanced technological capabilities do we currently have at our disposal in space?
No, I mean in terms of rockets in general, because even American analysts, Vladimir Vladimirovich, when they analyze it, say it's very expensive. Yes, space is an expensive program, but its weak point is that as a countermeasure, much cheaper rocket technologies can be developed that will be able to overcome it. This was also considered back in Reagan's time. Cheaper, much cheaper.
I probably don't know a lot of things for sure, but do we have broadband internet with the same coverage as Starlink or OneWeb? No? Do we have a multi-thousand constellation of low-orbit satellites in operation? And we, ready as we are, can now, for example, demonstrate those options that at least outwardly resemble the Buran shuttles we buried in the Soviet Union, while Boeings are still flying. And we already have the technology for reusable stages worked out. So when we talk about it, yes, we could probably perform in the style of a craftsman. Give us a flea and we'll break it. But that's not the point. Can we actually make the flea?
We can.
I don't see it yet. Because it's not a matter of desire, it's a matter of state policy and investment. For a long period of time, basically since the late 80s, we hardly worked on space at all. Now, in fact, this is a problem that needs to be solved at the state level. So now there are talented young guys who have come to lead Roscosmos. There's a certain project there called Bureau, but to make this happen, you need massive investments. But if our private entrepreneurs prefer to warm their butts in Courchevel, they're not actually implementing truly worthy projects. Amazing logic. Of course, it's all the fault of the fifth column, who prefer Courchevel. And the fact that all the money is going to the war, and that's why there are no investments. Well, sorry, that's just how it is. That's whose foot needs to be stepped on. As it was said in one old good book, whatever you reach for, there's nothing there. It suddenly turned out that, aside from Starlinks, there's another rather unexpected shortage: body bags.
Hello everyone, this is the Svoy group. Greetings from the tourist, greetings from our team to everyone who cares. Right now we need your help with evacuation. The guys from the Kupiansk direction urgently need body bags. Thank you so much. Thanks to you, we are moving forward. Together we are strong. Victory will be ours.
What a remarkable video, in my opinion. We're moving forward. We urgently need body bags in order to keep moving forward. To the body bags. Well, this video, I think, should serve as an epigraph to what's happening in Russia today. There aren't enough body bags. That's the main shortage. And since the situation with the Starlink blockade has already effectively brought Russian occupiers' attacks to a halt and looks like a complete dead end, especially, of course, given the shortage of body bags, Russian propaganda is also at an impasse. It's absolutely unclear how to respond. Should they threaten Musk with Star Wars, like Solovyov does? Okay, but that won't restore the Russian occupiers' vision. And fighting blindly isn't really an option. So Solovyov resorts to a method you could call the drunken hedgehog method or the couldn't care less method. Solovyov declares that if Starlink is destroyed, we'll switch to carrier pigeons shouting and tapping messages.
Pay attention to the immense love between Elon Musk and the scoundrel, murderer, thief, and Russophobe, Ukraine's current Minister of Defense, Fedorov, who, let me remind you, calls for the killing of 50,000 Russians. And Musk is ready to give him worldwide support by blocking certain capabilities, for which, by the way, he gets paid. As for Starlink, and let's have no illusions here, there is no such thing as an independent Starlink company. When Musk was directly asked why there are no foreigners working in his organizations, only green card holders, it was explained in several projects. You understand, these are requirements of the American government. That's why, in the American press, and I'm sure Trump doesn't even know about this, they are fighting Russia through a number of companies. And these companies are well known. Now, there should be no doubt about it for anyone. In addition to what we traditionally consider the military-industrial complex, this also includes talent pools, those working on artificial intelligence and other related programs. And this also includes the much-admired in Russia Elon Musk and his company. Based on this, we must understand that we need to build a system of counteraction not only at the state level. We simply need to clearly identify where the enemy is. And the militarization of space that is now being proposed, well, let's tell the truth. What is Starlink? It's the militarization of space, because everything Musk has worked on, everything we see now, serves the interests of the war against Russia. Everything the volunteer is doing is battlefield testing, for killing Russians, for waging war against us. We need to call things by their proper names. That's why I don't understand, for example, why Elon Musk's satellites are not considered a legitimate target for us. A single detonation of a nuclear weapon in space, as I understand it, would pretty seriously solve this problem. I'm not saying that's a good thing. But right now, when they're proposing to deploy even larger constellations, which will also be used for computing capabilities, this information came out today. Plus, and do you think those million Optimus robots that Musk announced, which will be produced at Tesla factories that previously made various car models, where will they end up? In
space. We had a similar situation when we were building our missile defense system with nuclear interception, but unfortunately, a nuclear explosion in space is indiscriminate. It hits our own as well.
Of course, there's no doubt about that. But considering how far behind we are,
Yes, you can.
at the low-level
Orbits, and
we will return once again, as has often been the case throughout history, to the use of carrier pigeons and other well-proven and reliable means of communication,
here,
by loudly shouting over each other, or by carefully tapping out their messages.
We can also recall the signal flags that the Red Army used for some time. Well, there are plenty of prospects. There's still room to fall. Besides Starlink, the Russian occupiers had a second ally, Telegram. But while Starlink is shut down by Musk, Telegram is blocked by the Russian authorities themselves. In other words, Roskomnadzor is essentially acting against the Russian army. And here's what Russian propagandists have to say about this.
This is a topic that I believe we are obliged to raise in the media right now, because, let me explain. At the moment, the communications of the armed forces of the Russian Federation on the front line rely on two pillars. The first pillar is Starlink, the second pillar is Telegram. Lately, there have been attempts to somehow tighten control over Telegram here, and this is public information. Komnadzor is talking about this and so on, which undermines the combat effectiveness of the units. And as my admin wrote to me today, we're being attacked from the front by the United States with the shutdown of Starlink, and from the rear we're being hit by the shutdown of Telegram. At the moment, just so you understand, Telegram contains files with firmware for drones and firmware files for radios. All objective monitoring and everything else is transmitted through it. Whether that's good or bad, it's an objective fact and reality. The entire system of horizontal connections is built through that same Telegram. Well, okay, Telegram is a separate story. Right now, we're talking about Starlink. If they create whitelists for these Starlinks, then all our terminals will shut down. For example, how does a tank at the front line operate right now? There's a small Starlink on the tank. The V5, I know, costs 35,000 rubles. At the moment. It's installed on every tank. Through this Starlink, the guys working from the tank access the internet. On a tablet or phone, they get a live feed from a Mavic drone flying high above, and so they fire from the tank, and the shells, they can see in real time where their shells are landing. Adjustments, elevation, direction, side. At the same time, via voice communication over the internet, they're in contact with the commander, and the commander gives them instructions on where to fire. At this house, the next house, this trench, and so on. If all of this collapses, then, for example, we fall back to the last century in terms of how our armored vehicles interact with drones. This is just a specific case. Trenches, command posts, everywhere, everything runs on Starlink. The exception is the Kursk and Belgorod regions, those border areas we've been talking about. Where Starlink doesn't work, that's where they go. Heroic communications specialists have laid cable there. Just regular internet cable, and from that. That's how command posts operate there, but that's because, first of all, it's access to old territory, and it simply doesn't work there physically. Starlink doesn't work there, neither for us, nor, by the way, for our counterparts.
Well, aside from this incredibly dramatic lament about the Starlink satellites, the main core content of Russian propaganda remains rooted in blatant lies. And as you well know, these lies are just so incredibly transparent and pervasive, brazen and shameless that it's not even clear who it's meant for. Obviously, everyone understands that these people are lying, but apparently there's this psychological mindset that, well, they're ours and they're lying in the right direction. This kind of brazen and shameless lying is the ticket to Russian television, and a vivid example of how people who initially have some kind of expert potential, and after all, expert potential requires you to say things that actually correspond to reality, well, these people who start out as experts, once they get on Russian television, turn into dumb liars. And a prime, illustrative example of this phenomenon is the retired Russian colonel Mikhail Kodaryonok, who recently hit a brand new propaganda low with his controversial public statement that the Russian military forces do not ever strike civilian residential areas.
It should be emphasized, especially emphasized, that the armed forces of the Russian Federation do not deliberately strike residential areas with any kind of weaponry. They only destroy infrastructure facilities, which in addition to defense industry sites, of course, in one way or another, also affect housing and utilities. So that's how things stand.
At the same time, I want to remind you how they appeared in the Western media. A large number of reports have shown how apartments in high-rise buildings are being turned into workshops for assembling unmanned aerial vehicles.
And electricity, well, you just can't separate it. This flow goes here, that flow goes there, and so on and so forth. This problem needs to be solved, as they say, comprehensively. So now things are bad for you, and I just want to reach out to certain political figures and the broadest segments of Ukraine. But again, for everything that has been done, sooner or later, there has to be some accountability.
To be perfectly honest with you, I truly believe that at some point in the near or distant future, Mr. Khodorenko will inevitably have to be held fully accountable for every single action he has done. And perhaps one specific manifestation of this responsibility will be an attempt to explain to 4-year-old Milana, a girl who was orphaned after a Russian shelling, that Russians do not strike residential areas. And in general, being forced to watch a large number of reports showing how Russian missiles, Russian bombs, and Russian drones deliberately destroyed residential areas, I think that is something that should accompany this punishment. By the way, why did I single out this particular person from the general group of liars? The thing is, Mikhail Mikhailovich Khodarenok distinguished himself, among other things, by what he did on the eve of the invasion, on February 3rd, 2022. He published an article in Nezavismaya Gazeta titled The Predictions of Bloodthirsty Political Scientists About Enthusiastic Hawks, and in which he explained in detail and thoroughly why the statements of certain Russian politicians do not correspond to reality. Namely, the claim that Russia could deliver a crushing defeat to Ukraine within a few hours if a military conflict were to begin. At the very beginning of the war, he published several articles, several videos, and made a few statements. Both in spoken and written Russian, he expressed himself in the same vein. In other words, he said that it was unrealistic to win this war. In other words, he was once a real expert. But the desire to appear and remain on Russian television requires conformity, that is, to eradicate one's expertise and develop a blunt propagandistic dishonesty, which in fact Mikhail Mikhailovich has quite successfully done, as evidenced by the fragment just shown. Besides lies, an important component of Russian propaganda is hatred and schadenfreude, a genuine joy at the fact that harm has been done to certain people. We have driven Ukraine back to the Stone Age. This is how the Kremlin's Goebbels rejoices, taking pleasure in the fact that, as a result of shelling by Russian terrorists, the situation in Ukraine is starting to resemble what, for the most part, is happening in Russia even now, without any war.
They're shouting something. They're celebrating something. Right now there is a severe cold snap. And the system is such that even what is still working, well, its energy system is very sensitive to any imbalance. And that's why a man-made disaster is also unfolding as the main components are knocked out and then you try to push the system harder. Of course, the system has started to spiral out of control. So what happens next? Well, Kiev will turn into a giant cesspool. Essentially what has happened is exactly what the Holy Fathers predicted would occur if the Lavra were desecrated. But it didn't happen because of the dam being destroyed, but rather because the residents are, to put it bluntly, being forced to foul their own city.
A separate issue is the target audience of these appeals, the recipients of the calls that Russian propaganda constantly makes. In particular, Solovyov quite often addresses Ukrainians, urging them to leave their cities and surrender. For example, in his latest address on Evening Mudozvon, he directed his message to the residents of Kharkiv. Residents of Kharkiv, leave your damn city. If you want us to show you mercy, surrender. Surrender, though, to be honest, Pomyat didn't specify exactly how peaceful Kharkiv residents are supposed to surrender. However, it's pretty clear what the people of Kharkiv would say in response to him.
Strongly, in fact.
That's exactly right.
No, not me. Now he's going to start with his usual talk about strength. He's about to start talking about Kyiv again. And I think, yeah, he's going to drag out that song again while at the same time Belgorod is getting hammered. And I'm supposed to feel sorry for those idiots, those Nazis. And then look, read what people write to me. On your show, when Belgorod was being pounded, Vasily was calling to destroy those bastards. Exactly. And to spare the prisoners when they surrender. But for Belgorod to be left alone, Kharkiv must not exist. So residents of Kharkiv, leave that cursed city, because your city is being used as a base to launch strikes on Belgorod. Am I expressing my thoughts clearly enough? Do you want us to show you mercy? Surrender, but leave the city. That's it, the jokes are over. For Belgorod, do you understand what was said? For the tears of our mothers. I
am quite critical of Cesare Lombroso's theories that you can identify a criminal by their appearance. But there are exceptions. State Duma Deputy Nikolai Valuev could serve as a good illustration of the validity of the Italian psychiatrist's theory, especially after Nikolai Sergeyevich stepped out of his usual role as a brawler, put on a deputy's badge, and started discussing geopolitics and giving valuable advice to young people.
The great philosopher Dugin. For 30 years we gave treats to the post-Soviet republics. It didn't help. We need the stick. That's why we're preparing the youth. I advise Zoomers to go to the gym and take up masculine sports.